I'm Nathan, and join me as I cover cases where millionaires built the craziest private amusement parks money could buy, only to die inside the very attractions they created. From a millionaire reopening an abandoned amusement park with illegal activity to another, making one final bungee jump above a tidal lagoon before people realized something was off. It was August 19, 2016, and the desert outside Reno, Nevada was still radiating heat long after the sun had started to sink. The dry air out there doesn't cool down easily, and by evening, the temperature on the flatlands was still hovering in the low 90s. Vicki Glome was 43 years old. She had made her money in real estate investment, buying, developing, and flipping properties across the American West. She was sharp, ambitious, and completely addicted to the spotlight. The kind of person who didn't just host parties, she performed at them. She had poured nearly $11 million into making sure she had the most unforgettable backyard in Nevada. Across 14 acres behind her estate, Vicki had built a fully operational private amusement park, carnival booths, a miniature coaster, bumper cars, food stands, and at the center of it all, a compressed air launch tower. The ride shot a steel capsule roughly 85 feet straight up. It was the crown jewel of the property. She hosted invitation-only events regularly, and this night was one of her biggest, a packed influencer party where dozens of guests were actively live streaming. The cameras were always rolling at Vicki's parties, and I think that's exactly what drove most of the decisions she made that night. The compressed air launch tower had a troubled history. The hardware had been purchased secondhand from a recently closed amusement attraction. Earlier that week, contractors had placed the ride in a manual diagnostics and calibration mode used for testing launches and timing systems. In that setting, several normal safety interlocks were temporarily bypassed so technicians could cycle the ride during maintenance. The mode was never intended for passengers, but the system had not been switched back to full operational status before the party began. One side of the shoulder harness had also failed to fully latch during previous test cycles. Maintenance logs confirmed a sensor occasionally registered as locked even when it wasn't. Contractors had flagged it. Vicki had been told. None of it stopped the party. I keep on thinking about how many warnings does it take before Vicki shuts the whole thing down. That evening, Gerson, in his early 40s, who had been drinking while helping manage attractions, entered the operator booth. While handling the controls for the livestream countdown sequence, he initiated the launch cycle without realizing the ride was still running in manual test mode. Because the system was still configured for diagnostics, the capsule launched immediately without the full restraint verification sequence normally required during standard operation. Vicki was already inside. She had climbed in alone in front of a crowd holding up their phones. She was wearing only the lap restraint, skipping the shoulder harness because she wanted the ride to feel faster on camera. And this is the kind of mistake that probably never happens if he's sober. Based on experience, when alcohol's involved, people get careless without realizing it. Without proper upper body restraint, her torso lifted violently as the capsule climbed the rails. The partially latched shoulder harness gave way completely. Her upper body rose freely while her lower body remained caught by the lap belt, and she slammed into part of the steel support structure running beside the track as the capsule accelerated upward. The impact caused catastrophic injuries to her chest and neck. She was pulled free of the seat near the upper section of the tower, roughly 8 stories above the concrete, and witnesses described her striking a steel crossbeam before falling to the base of the loading platform. Deputies arrived to find the ride still powered on. Vicki was pronounced dead at the scene from catastrophic head, chest, and spinal injuries. Investigators confirmed the shoulder restraints had never fully engaged before the capsule fired. The man who triggered the launch was questioned, and witnesses described both his location and his condition at the time. The ride was dismantled months later. Next story involves a man leading a group tour through his own underground cave attraction, a roller coaster running directly overhead, and a ceiling that workers had been watching crack for weeks. When it finally came down fast. It was May 7, 2019, and the Ozark Hills outside Branson, Missouri were still holding on to the dampness of an unusually wet spring. The trees were green but heavy. The The soil was soft in places that it shouldn't be. Kevin Broff was 51, an entertainment investor whose fortune came from financing luxury resorts, casinos, and major theme park expansions across the country. After retiring, he spent millions building a private amusement park on wooded land outside Branson. It featured a towering wooden roller coaster, staffed midway games, animatronic attractions, and an underground limestone grotto system beneath the property. The centerpiece was a massive natural cave directly underneath one of the coaster's main support sections. Kevin didn't want it to look like a theme park cave. He wanted it to look expensive. Most attractions use lightweight foam or resin panels for underground theming because they're manageable, safe, and easy to anchor. Kevin rejected that entirely. He imported actual quarry limestone slabs because, in his mind, real stone signaled real money. It was the difference between a rich man's hobby and something that looked like one. The material became a point of pride for him before a single slab was ever installed. And I get him. When you've spent years funding other people's ideas, finally building something of your own makes you want to prove you can do it too and make it even better. He didn't just use limestone for the walls. He used it for the ceiling. Massive quarried slabs anchored into retrofitted support mesh overhead, far heavier than what the system was ever designed to carry. But to Kevin, the weight was the point. Thin panels looked cheap. Real stone had presence. It looked like something that cost what it actually cost. Over time, the cave expanded. New decorative chambers were dug out to make the tour more immersive, pushing deeper and closer to the structural anchor points buried beneath the coaster's support columns above. Every coaster pass sent vibrations shaking down through the ground. Dust would fall from the ceiling cracks whenever a train crossed overhead. The unusually wet spring had been saturating the cave walls for weeks, and visible cracks had begun spreading near portions of the chamber roof. To Kevin, the cracking gave the limestone character. It looked natural. It looked like the real thing. On May 7th, a group of online content creators arrived to film the attractions. Kevin led them personally underground, while coaster operations continued above. The group stopped in the main chamber while Kevin explained how the cave had been built. A coaster train crossed overhead. The rumble shook loose dust from the ceiling, which was routine. But then came a sound that wasn't part of the routine, a deep crack that didn't sound like the track. Pebbles fell first, then small limestone chunks scattered across the walkway. A slab the size of a dining table came down behind the group, partially blocking the entrance tunnel. Kevin moved immediately toward a maintenance passage near the exit staircase. But before he reached it, several ceiling sections gave way directly above him. The first piece struck him across the shoulders and drove him face first onto the concrete path. Additional sections collapsed across his lower body. A water pipe burst and sprayed mud across the chamber. Witnesses scrambled for the service tunnel while the ceiling continued breaking apart. This was the day Kevin had been waiting for. He finally had the audience to see what he had built it all for. What he didn't expect was that the masterpiece he had built had its own plans for the finale. Operators running the coaster above ground didn't trigger an emergency stop immediately because the underground rumbling sounded from the surface like ordinary ride vibration. Emergency crews spent more than an hour stabilizing the remaining structure before safely entering. Kevin was found, pinned beneath several limestone slabs, and pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators documented extensive cracking near the coaster's anchor points above the grotto. Their conclusion was that repeated vibration from daily operations combined with months of water infiltration and the excessive weight of the real limestone ceiling caused cumulative structural failure. The expanded chambers pushed too close to the support anchors were identified as a critical factor. Several underground sections were demolished. The coaster was shut down and never fully reopened. The private amusement park sat largely abandoned after that. For the next case, a summer party at a private water park became the last event a woman ever hosted. It was July 22, 2018 in Scottsdale, Arizona, and the desert heat that evening had barely let up. The kind of thick, dry air that makes neon light look almost liquid when it bounces off water. Behind a sprawling private estate on the eastern edge of the city, a full-scale water park was running at capacity. A private one, built by one woman for one purpose: to make sure that every person she invited never forgot where they spent their summer. Dorothy Skent was 48 years old, a self-made real estate developer who had spent 2 decades flipping luxury properties across the Southwest. She was sharp, decisive, and deeply competitive, not just professionally, but socially. People who knew her described someone who measured success in reactions. She didn't just want guests to have a good time. She wanted them to leave stunned. The water park behind her mansion was built on that instinct. Water slides, a lazy river, a swim-up bar, a surf machine, diving platforms, and at the center of it all, a custom-built infinity wave pool that used industrial-grade intake pumps to generate rolling artificial surf across the length of the pool. Weeks before the July party, one of the wave pool's protective intake grates, the heavy steel covers that sit flush against the pool floor and prevent the suction from grabbing anything it shouldn't, had cracked during routine maintenance. The grate was pulled. A replacement was on order. Staff understood the pool would run at reduced wave settings until the cover arrived. That was the plan. Dorothy had a different plan for party night. What if they had just stood their ground and refused to let Dorothy into the wave pool? Based on Dorothy's personality, I bet it might have caused an argument, maybe even ruined the mood for the day. The event was a neon-themed night session. Dozens of guests moved through the lit attractions while a DJ set echoed across the water. Underwater lights turned the wave pool into something that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. Guests were filming constantly, synchronized dives, slow-motion footage, content for their platforms. Dorothy moved through it all with a waterproof camera, documenting everything herself. At some point during the evening, the wave intensity was increased. Witnesses confirmed she had pushed the settings higher for a more dramatic look on video. Dorothy entered the water and swam toward the strongest section near the infinity edge. She dove beneath the surface to capture underwater footage of the waves breaking above her. What happened next took seconds. As she descended, her swimsuit and upper thigh made contact with the exposed intake opening on the pool floor. The suction sealed her body against it almost instantly. She couldn't pull free. The pump pressure at elevated settings generated enough force to hold her pinned to the floor, regardless of how hard she pushed against it. From the surface, the situation wasn't immediately obvious. Her upper body remained partially visible beneath the churning water, and guests initially assumed she was holding her breath for the camera. By the time witnesses realized something was wrong, she had already been under far too long. One man dove in to pull her free. He surfaced without her. The suction was too strong to overcome by hand. I think this is the moment everything changed. If Dorothy had left the wave settings where staff originally kept them, there's a good chance none of this could happen to her. The emergency shutoff controls were located near the filtration system on the opposite end of the property. Staff ran through a crowded, active water park to reach them while guests screamed from the pool deck. The music kept playing. The waves kept rolling. By the time the pumps shut down and the suction released, Dorothy had been trapped underwater for several minutes. Guests pulled her free and began CPR near the pool deck. Paramedics pronounced her dead shortly after arriving. Investigators drained the wave pool and documented everything. The intake vent had been operating without its protective grate. The emergency shutoff was not accessible from the pool area. Party videos confirmed the wave intensity had been elevated that evening. Maintenance workers acknowledged the missing grate had been discussed before the event. The official findings were direct: an unguarded industrial intake vent running at elevated pump pressure on a private installation with no emergency access near the hazard. The exposed intake was later filled with concrete during partial demolition. The water park never operated again. That story was already disturbing enough, but the next one wasn't about a ride malfunction at all. The real danger was hidden underneath the amusement park itself. And before that, we've got more shocking amusement park disasters coming up. So hit that subscribe button if you want to see how extreme wealth and private attractions turned into deadly nightmares for their own owners. It was October 14th, 2017, in Taney County, Missouri, and the air around Hollow Creek Park already felt strange long before police entered the property. The temperature had dropped into the low 50s that night, and fog from nearby woods mixed with artificial smoke drifting through the midway from the park's Halloween attractions. The owner of the park was Kenneth Vrax, a 51-year-old businessman who reportedly owned multiple waterfront homes, traveled in a private jet leased through one of his companies, and spent years buying failing properties across the Midwest before reopening them as high-profit entertainment ventures. Kenneth purchased a Hollow Creek Park after it had been abandoned for years following storm damage and financial losses. Instead of fully restoring it, he reopened only parts of the property for private events and Halloween weekends. Large sections of the park stayed closed off. Former employees later told investigators that Kenneth rarely allowed workers near the rear maintenance garages or underground service corridors. Those tunnels had originally been built decades earlier for plumbing and electrical access, but over time, they became one of the most suspicious parts of the property after newer locks and surveillance cameras appeared around entrances that employees were told were abandoned. As I see it, the more someone tries to cover something up, the more it sticks out. Locks, cameras, and off-limits signs only make people wonder more. In the weeks leading up to the incident, investigators had already started watching the park after receiving information from a former worker about illegal activity connected to backstage areas. Surveillance teams reportedly observed delivery vans entering through rear service roads late at night while guards patrolled sections of the property after guests had gone home. But on the night of October 14th, the park was crowded with Halloween visitors. Families moved through haunted attractions while actors walked between fog machines and flashing lights. Because the event already used fake emergency effects as part of the show, many guests initially thought the arriving officers were performers. According to witness videos, confusion spread quickly once deputies started forcing people toward the exits with rifles drawn. Some guests continued filming because they still believed the raid was part of the attraction. Kenneth was reportedly inside a maintenance garage near the old carousel building with 2 security guards when officers entered the backstage area. Investigators later said the 3 men fled through an employee hallway connected to the underground utility tunnels beneath the park. The tunnels were narrow concrete corridors lined with exposed pipes and drainage channels. Officers moving through the passageways later reported hearing gunfire deeper inside the tunnel system. During the exchange, a bullet struck an overhead water pipe, causing water to spray across the floor and down a nearby maintenance shaft. One of the guards surrendered near a tunnel junction, but Kenneth continued deeper underground before climbing a fixed steel ladder leading toward an emergency hatch 18 feet above the tunnel floor. Investigators later concluded that water from the damaged pipe had spread across the ladder rungs. Kenneth was also carrying a short rifle attached to a shoulder sling while climbing upward. Near the upper section of the shaft, he apparently slipped on the wet ladder as the rifle shifted sideways against his body. He fell backward the entire distance down the shaft and struck the concrete floor below. The back of his head impacted the raised steel edge of a drainage channel running along the tunnel floor. Deputies reaching the bottom reported catastrophic head injuries and no meaningful movement after the fall. Kenneth Vrax was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Authorities later confirmed he died from blunt force trauma sustained during the fall. Investigators spent the following days searching backstage buildings and underground corridors throughout the property. Several employees and guards were arrested on weapons and obstruction charges, while detectives also confirmed hidden maintenance rooms had been converted into makeshift overnight living spaces. Personally speaking, Kenneth already had more than most people could ever want: houses, a jet, businesses that made him millions. Why risk everything just to grab more? I wasn't expecting the next one to bother me as much as it did. 85 feet above a tidal lagoon, one person saw the risk coming and said something, and the woman who could have stopped it chose the sunset instead. It was September 3rd, 2015, along a private waterfront estate just outside Savannah, Georgia, when a sunset that should have been beautiful became the last thing a crowd of guests would ever want to remember. The Georgia coast in early September carries that particular kind of heat, thick, still, with salt in the air, and the tide doing its slow, indifferent work along the limestone edges of the shore. By late afternoon, the water level in the tidal lagoon beneath a private bungee tower had dropped several feet from where it had been just hours before. That detail mattered more than anyone at the party seemed willing to admit. Lita Drass was 46 years old, a self-made woman with a reputation for going bigger than anyone expected. She worked in private real estate development and had spent years converting a coastal property into something that could only be described as a personal passion project. A fully operational waterfront amusement park built on her own land. Carnival games, zip lines, a midway strip of lights and color, and a bungee tower rising roughly 85 feet above a tidal lagoon just off the boardwalk. Every Labor Day, she threw a party that people talked about for months. Influencers, boat owners, local figures, they all showed up, and Lita loved it. She had the kind of personality that didn't just enjoy a crowd, she performed for one. She was generous, charismatic, and almost constitutionally resistant to being told no. The bungee operation on her property was manually managed, meaning workers adjusted cord length based on the changing tide below the platform. Earlier in the afternoon, they had configured the setup for higher water conditions, a reasonable call at the time. But tides don't negotiate. By the time sunset arrived and the golden hour light was spreading across the lagoon, the water level had dropped significantly, exposing jagged submerged limestone that had been safely below the surface hours before. One of the workers flagged it. He reportedly made clear the cord needed to be shortened before anyone else jumped, Lita was told. She jumped anyway. I can't stop thinking about this. She built the entire attraction, so she understood that system better than anyone there. That's why it's hard to see this as simple ignorance when the danger was already being pointed out. She had strapped a helmet camera to herself for the jump. Guests lined the boardwalk and midway below, phones out, watching as she climbed onto the platform railing and dove headfirst toward the lagoon. The cord stretched fast. People cheered. And then, within seconds, those watching from below began to realize something was wrong. She was descending lower than any of the earlier jumps that day. Her upper body hit the shallow water first. Then, the front of her head made direct contact with a submerged limestone rock. The impact caused catastrophic head and upper spinal injuries. The cord recoiled, pulling her back upward, but the damage was already irreversible. Strong coastal crosswinds caught her body during the rebound, swinging her laterally toward the rock wall bordering the attraction. Witnesses on the boardwalk screamed. Workers rushed to stabilize the oscillating cord, while carnival music continued playing across the park, a detail that survivors later described as deeply disorienting. One guest filming from the dock dropped their phone and stepped back. Several people near the water became visibly sick. It took workers a few minutes to bring the line under control and stop the motion above the lagoon. By then, the guests around the midway were being moved away from the surrounding rides and attractions. The sound of screaming had reportedly carried across the waterfront to nearby residences. Responders arrived by boat. The rocky shoreline made direct vehicle access impossible, and that alone added precious minutes to a situation that had already ended. Lita was pronounced dead at the scene. The official findings confirmed what the worker had warned about before the jump. The cord had not been shortened to account for the lower tide conditions. Investigators documented visible impact damage and blood staining on the limestone rocks directly beneath the jump zone. Multiple guests voluntarily turned over footage they had recorded from the boardwalk and midway, which helped reconstruct the sequence of events. The bungee tower and surrounding attractions were shut down immediately during the investigation, and portions of the lagoon-side amusement area were later dismantled. Authorities concentrated their inquiry on the private operation of the attraction itself, with no broader industry reforms following from the case. To me, the lesson here isn't really about bungee cords or tide charts. It's about what happens when the need to keep going becomes stronger than the willingness to stop and listen.